I saw something a while ago. I found it disturbing. It was an executive order under former President George H.W. Bush. I had to do with the war in Iraq. It was dated for Valentine's Day, and it was discussing the distribution of and the transport of goods on two different tracks. One associated with medical assistance for people that had been subjected to um, some form of injury, medical assistance, humanitarian assistance to Iraq, as well as mobilization of a form of military assistance. It was a specific Valentine's Day pairing of military assistance and medical assistance. And to be honest with you, when I saw it, came after a traumatic event in my life that had happened on a Valentine's Day. And I was disturbed because I understood that there was a direct causal relationship between the traumatic event that had just occurred and that executive order. But there seems to have been a process whereby for several years that kind of systematology has been at work. And it went into a specific kind of praxis within the United States at the onset of the Affordable Care Act, but had been in development in myriad manners prior to that. The specific methodology and the specific correlation of events goes back to that Bush era executive order. Now, I've elsewhere attempted to invoke another Bush era executive order, and the efforts to move forward on that have been met with unsatisfactory responses. Meanwhile, I'm in a particular track where I'm trying to reconcile the possibilities, but also the resulting disparities that have occurred in connection with abuse of that particular executive order, or in connection with a kind of cultural paradigm that without an appropriate check against abuse has been allowed to exploit and sabotage both. I experienced this recently here in Texas with events going on concurrent to where I used to work in San Francisco just this year. I'd attempted to get a job, and one of the major reasons I wanted to get the job was A, I wanted to be able to have more say over my own food access. There's nothing wrong with a food bank. There's good things that happen with food banks. But when you're perfectly able bodied, perfectly capable of working, there's no reason why, if there's a job available that could assist you in getting access to food, including organic food, you shouldn't be allowed to do that. Unless there's something else going on with the economy that has specifically identified that certain people are not even supposed to be able to have say over their own food access and food choices. And I contend that's exactly what's been going on. That it's a part of a genetic engineering regime that is racially selective. And in its racial selectivity, it establishes particular quotas of who, from what perceived demographic, is allowed to have access to what kinds of food options at what time. That is how pervasive this corruption is. And in the meantime, what do you want to do if you actually have a healthcare need? Well, I was at one point able to be among people who identified themselves as healers, including healers that engaged with various kinds of services that may have some sort of government support or some sort of formal institutional instantiation. One of the things they wanted to focus on at the time, at least, was prevention. This understanding of allowing for yourself to be fortified. And in the course of being engaged in some form of preventative health situation, not just, by the way, about getting billings for x-rays or mammograms, but for purposes connected to appropriate nutrition, access to exercise regularly, being able to use that in connection with various kinds of social organizing that allow for a balance so that people are able to engage in activities and be able to do things in a manner that provides a holism as opposed to being stagnated and or subjected to a sort of monotony that allows for the exacerbation of a pre-existing injury. It also allows for the conceptualization of modalities wherein people have natural regenerative possibilities that they can self-heal and or even be put into a situation where they can help other people with healing, including in natural manners, and including using medicine or using things that provide for us that we can get from nature. There are foods that are medicinal, There are also supplements that are involved in a variety of points of access, including some of which are produced by communities, including communities in places where those herbs or those items are indigenous, that want to be able to engage with other parts of the world, to augment what they have with what they know can complement it, and to provide other people with what they have in order to heal themselves and to take care of themselves. And these are very important things that don't need to intersect through a major corporation, including a major corporation in a co-located partnership with energy. Because we produce our own energy. We are energy producers as well as consumers. So what we put into our body and how we get what we put into our body is very important. Now, I will say that in the fall of September and October 2019, I had come into access to a report that had been a dissertation provided by an officer of the Brazilian military that was studying within the United States. The 25th anniversary for that report was a proposal of his was coming up. I did not have a chance to read it comprehensively, but I understood it as almost like a form of investment in a shared leadership paradigm around national security matters related to the Western Hemisphere. It didn't necessarily have to be about armed conflict and the concept of a alliance, including a military alliance within a particular hemispheric sphere, addressing all of the important national security matters therein. Doesn't necessarily even have to be dominated or led by the United States. That's how I saw this. The concern then was that it also happened to correlate with a timeline around an audit that had been provided by somebody who, as far as I've been learning, engaged in audits that were very, very important during his term of service as the Comptroller General of the United States of America. His specific reference point was a notification he had made regarding database management for federal databases and the understanding of what and how to access information. And the specific example he used had to do with the Department of Agriculture and food access. I saw these two as actually being very complementary, not just in terms of function and logistics, but also in terms of the concepts and the principles around understanding how different people and different groups can be identified in connection with a particular kind of resource acquisition that may or may not be appropriate in consideration of another kind of resource acquisition, and how mischaracterization and misidentifying the kinds of resources certain communities need, want, or have can allow for inappropriate risk leveraging that would then allow for things that should be understood to be basic, necessary, primary reference points for things everybody needs to be put into a situation of speculation where 25 years, 35 years later, you end up with a system where it's literally genetically engineering certain people to be allowed to have certain kinds of food and genetically engineering other people to not even be able to tolerate ingestion of those foods. Then we get into other kinds of conspiracies that will be discussed at another time. But in the meantime, what do you do if you need health care? What do you do if you have, goodness gracious knows, a situation where you're in a society where people get pregnant and they want to keep their baby? You know, this is the kind of world that some people live in, a lot of people, including people in the United States. Whatever your political considerations are around all these other matters, the truth of the matter is that motherhood is sacred. Motherhood is absolutely necessary. And protecting and providing for our mothers should be one of the most highly sought after acts of honor. And it should be a primary consideration in every other thing we do. That includes and specifically starts with healthcare. Now, I'm perfectly fertile woman at the prime of her life. Relatively, actually, pretty damn good shape. I have no kids. At this point in time, to be honest with you, I'm not going to be having kids anytime soon. Let's put it that way. But we're in a situation where there are people, especially in the stressors of these circumstances we're in, that might either be preparing to have children or have just had children themselves. And in the course of this, there is a specific manner in which different people in these societies should be able to work together in order to provide for that. I have no problem supporting maternal health care, but it's an understanding of what is the expectation of maternal health care. It shouldn't be something that is speculated on, and it shouldn't be something that is allowed to be leveraged as somebody else's opportunistic political agenda. And in the course of that, one of the things that is important is assuring that mothers get the best that they possibly can. And for that reason, I came up with a very basic healthcare budget with that as my priority. It's not that I don't agree with healthcare, and it's not that I would cut healthcare off from people, but making healthcare a form of military access mechanism as its primary definition, or allowing for healthcare to be the primary economic factorization into a development of a political engineering paradigm, it's not appropriate. Now, what I've done is, while I was working at the store, I came up with a budget which would understand as a form of preventative but also maintenance needs. Pregnant women have a slightly different biophysical need than women who are not pregnant. But women who are not pregnant have a capacity to do things that women who are pregnant do not. And this can also mean various things that we could offer in terms of our life energy and or in terms of other things that we have, including our resource acquisition, especially during the time frames coming toward the delivery date and for the time frame after the time of delivery. Now, my understanding is legally under the Family Medical Leave Act that there is up to 6 months worth of maternity leave that can be given to a mother. And under the concept of parental leave, there are places that allow for 6 months for the mother and 6 months for the father, which could have a 1 year period during which time the baby at the first year of life is allowed to be in a direct supervision and experience the parent, either the mother or the father, or both the mother and the father concurrently, at least for 6 months to a year. So this kind of energetic paradigm is different, and it's not one anybody has a right to encroach upon. However, providing for the material needs, including the healthcare needs of these sorts of situations as needed, is available. So I came up with a paradigm wherein there could be a form of health maintenance or health prevention that could be engaged by a woman like me, that would also account for and budget in the capacity to provide the primary basic nutritional and kinds of health-related holistic considerations of what a mother would need. Now, if we were honest at this point in time about what COVID-19 actually is, and if we were honest right now about what the intention was behind allowing for COVID-19 to occur, this makes perfect sense. And it's something we could have been doing this whole time instead. But as we are where we are, I consider this to be the closest thing to an acceptable resolution of this paradigm that I can personally think of and that I literally have to offer. There might be other people similarly suited, and as a requirement, I believe, for us as citizens and as for us as people, including good people, people that have an understanding of what we owe to the earth and what we owe to each other by sharing the earth with each other at this point in time. This is very simple. The other matters can be addressed outside of this being the priority. Everything else is subordinate to making this the priority. And so, in that regard, I'd come up with a budget that could provide for my healthcare needs and the healthcare needs of a single mother without an emergency situation, that based upon what was available to me at the time as sources whereby these things could be acquired. And by the way, none of these things so far require prescription. None of them require any prescription. They are things that can be obtained at what would be considered to be markets, or the price points may vary. For instance, if there's a local supplier of something that somebody wants to preference. For instance, I will say, since COVID-19 has taken effect, I have not been to the farmer's market in downtown Dallas, but I know it exists. I've been there before. It's a very, very lovely place. I also know that there's at least 2 other farmers markets that are indoors. regular actual farmers markets, and then there are periodic farmers markets that come up. Depending upon what is available in your local farmers market, there may be a different price point and there might be a different frequency. So these are budgets based upon understanding that there would be a central place wherein these things would be consistently available so that as needed they can be restocked with a consistent price point. We're not taking into account the seasonal variation and or the considerations of what it might mean to have a relationship with a local supplier or a local farmer so that you can get things and then you would have to adjust the price accordingly. But the adjustments for that would not be too prohibitive. And for me, someone like me, for instance, if I had agreed to a paradigm like this and somebody were to say they needed some sort of modification within certain parameters because they have something locally that they would prefer to obtain as opposed to getting it through a central supplier, I'm not talking about product loyalty in order to establish any other kind of preference. And for me personally, the more readily accessible it is locally and the more it circulates within the local community, the better, right? So those things could all be very easily accommodated, very significantly taken into account. And so in this regard, I have, as I composed this budget, at the beginning of February, actually the into January, beginning of February, the anticipation was that I was going to actually start moving forward on acquiring it and implementing it by and throughout the month of February. So that by the month of March, I would actually be able to start in the first phase. I had budgeted for it per month. I had a per month budget, and then in accordance with other things that were to have been budgeted. But this was the per month budget, with an understanding that by the end of 1 year, that in terms of what I was working toward to build that budget, what would be available at the end of that year would then be a way to kind of solidify it, including with a kind of bond that could then be used as other things that would be associated with my personal business, which would, of course, supported this as some kind of healthcare paradigm or something comparable, for instance, for men that I might be working with or for other people that I might be working with within my own considerations of that. But also in terms of assuring that if, for instance, after 1 year or after a certain period of time, you have a relationship with somebody at the end of that year, there is a definable, definitive way to say the relationship we have with this particular kind of situation is now done, it's terminated, that person is free to move on, and then there is the possibility for some sort of security based upon what was experienced as the relationship that then allows for that to be given to the mother and her baby to provide for them in the future without feeling that there are any untoward or lingering obligations, including ones that might try to, shall we say, provide a form of credibility or credit to the people with whom they were previously engaged. See, this is a very important factor. When you go to the doctor and you get your healthcare treatment, there are all kinds of people that are involved in it economically. All kinds of people believe and understand that their job and their job safety is connected to your personal health safety and personal health safety of your family members. I personally don't like this modality, not just because me and my family have been subjected to a disproportionate percentage of employment for people in the medical sector that I contend for the most part was unjustified, but also because it shouldn't be a situation where our healthcare needs provide somebody else's job. It should be a different role they have in the community, and it should be one that is respected as sacred. It's not just about chastising healthcare workers for being involved in institutionalized systematologies. It's also about the desanctification of life-giving, life preservation, and life-saving. That is as much a spiritual need as it is a physical need. And so once the relationship ends, there should be a way to consecrate it in a manner that also provides for some sort of material stability and will allow for a form of connection with the material factors that are necessary for existence within our society, that does not encroach upon anybody's faith tradition and does not try to subject somebody to acknowledgement or participation in faith or religious paradigms they do not agree with. And so that was also part of what was implicit and inherent as well as explicit about this sort of paradigm. At the time I created the actual budget, which was on February 3rd of 2021, the total for 1 year was actually relatively modest. that the entirety of the budget connected to what would be necessary for a monthly, shall we say, a monthly additional supplement, which would be specifically for a pregnant mother. Then for the provision of health care on a monthly basis for both the mother that was pregnant and the mother that was not pregnant. Then, with some accounting for or adjustment for the fact that there would be additional cost or there would be a modification of cost associated with the young child, or the baby being brought into the paradigm, at least for a temporary period of time. So there would be a cost associated with that. And then also with an understanding that part of this was to account for the provision of a emergency preparedness paradigm as well. So not only is there the healthcare provision, but there's the reserve that is also being established and maintained, which could involve the acquisition of the emergency supplies that would be necessary to support the mother. The father, there's a different budget for the father, by the way, but the mother and the baby in the initial stages, with the understanding that over the course of this time frame, there would also be that emergency reserve that would be established, that would be between the mother and the baby, and the father and or maybe other people in the family, depending upon those modifications. So that by the time that 1 year is over, that's already prepared, and that everything is necessary for it to be put into effect is already established. And so rotation in and out of supplies, like for instance food, even in a emergency or in a sort of pantry situation or an emergency stockpile that one might have for their own personal family, food ages out. You have to rotate it. So you have to get new food to replace what you're taking out, and then you have to eat the food or you have to do something with the food when that time frame comes up. But those would already have been put into place, and the time frames around those would already have been put into place. So by the end of the year, everything that would be needed would be there. This would all be cumulative. And there was a budget that was associated with doing that. Now, I'm in a situation where I don't have a network of people that would be eligible to be a beneficiary of this kind of paradigm, even though it's something that I personally feel would be my priority. And it was what I was aspiring to. And it's already something I've been involved in one manner or another, without the kinds of confirmations, but also the kinds of, shall we say, safeguards that I would have felt would have been needed to be appropriately implemented and assured before I would have willingly consented, which I would have. But because we are in the situation we are, we're understanding this right now that I work with, in understanding that the healthcare budget, the healthcare responsibility or share that I would commit to, and that I think would be a sensible commitment, has a certain amount associated with it. In order to provide for the incipientness on a monthly basis, the mother, the expectant child, and the other mother that's supporting her, my budget understood it was about $310 a month for those three things. And then there was a factorization of a difference of about $100 over the course of that. The original budget starts off at around $192, and then it increases to $300 when factoring in for the other things that go into when it's being developed concurrent, so that by the time that year is up, by the time the year is over, then there is that transition that is possible, depending upon what else is done in the course of, for instance, what I would be doing with my time, that when that time frame, it's almost like a contribution to the future. And then the obligation is fulfilled. And once the obligation is fulfilled, then there is that possibility of allowing for it to, shall we say, be put into a situation where then the separate ways can be moved on. And in the course of being moved on, there's no anticipation that later in life there's going to be some lingering obligation or some lingering expectation that this early assistance in providing support to maternal child health care, or could also provide a template for other kinds of healthy relationships between parents and their children, and people that provide care or provide something else, including education, to children. There would be definitive moments at which there could be a separation, so that you don't spend 5 years, 10 years, 20 years connected to obligations associated with providing for somebody's job. And this is a very, very important distinction. These are the kinds of things I believe that an appropriate consideration of a healthcare paradigm could have taken into account and could have actually engaged us in the last 10 years and learning how to do and preparing us to do. And insofar as that was the case, then whatever COVID 19 is supposed to be would be completely different. We share energy all the time. Some people have a capacity to provide in a way that other people don't. Some people have a need at certain times that they may not have a need for at other times. And at those other times, they may have the capacity to provide something and somebody else can't provide in the moment. It doesn't have to be too complicated. But if we get into a situation where we're systematizing people's capabilities and allowing them to be engaged deceptively for extraction so that they can be assigned as propertied assets to corporations, including in manners that are completely dishonest, well, we don't have these possibilities, do we? What do we have instead? What happened in February of 2021 instead of this? Now, I'm not going to stick on that for this whole time, but it does remind me what happened in October of 2019 instead of what could have happened then. Right? We're already overdue. Hopefully, we're not at a point where women are going to stop having babies, including a woman like me. I'm still young enough potentially to one day have one, but I wouldn't accept healthcare outside of a paradigm that at least acknowledged this, right? As a possibility. So we all should be able to have a right to choose in these regards, but it's also important that we have appropriate options. If you're someone like me, perhaps this would be considered more on par or more on course with an option that you would find more, shall we say, suitable than those that have been previously offered. And in the meantime, there are other matters that will be attended to that would respect the understanding that this is a priority. But at the same time, it should also be a joy to be able to be shared and a pleasure to be experienced without having to worry about those other things. There's other people that can worry about those things.